When deciding whether to falsely imply Keir Starmer had protected Jimmy Savile, Boris Johnson faced a dilemma. On the one hand, whether or not the slur was true, Johnson wanted members of the public to have that association in the back of their minds. On the other, if it became too obvious what Johnson was doing and who he was appealing to, the stunt could backfire. As we know, Boris Johnson would ultimately take the risk, and he may be happy that Starmer and Savile are now two names often said in the same sentence on the evening news. He will, however, be less pleased that it's now obvious what pond scum he finds himself associated with. These were the scenes in Westminster on Monday afternoon, which have now been viewed by millions.
Move out of the way! Get back! Move out of the way! Get back! Keep going, out of the way! Out of the way! Out of the way! Protect your people! Protect your people!
So along with protesters telling Keir Starmer he should be hung, you heard them shout, "Why are you protecting paedophiles and just Jimmy Savile?" Now, Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle, was quick to draw a connection between Johnson's comments and the mob's actions.
I know it's been reported that some abuse was directed at the Right Honourable Member, the Leader of the Opposition yesterday, related to claims made by the Prime Minister in this chamber. But regardless of yesterday's incident, I made it clear last week that while the Prime Minister's words were not disorderly, they were inappropriate. As I said then, these sorts of comments only inflame opinions and generate disregard for the House, and it is not acceptable. Our words have consequences, and we should always be mindful of that fact.
Labour's Chris Bryant went further and referred to the smear as being part of a deliberate strategy to stir up hatred.
Well, let's go through the precise time frame of it. So last Monday, the Prime Minister was in terrible problems because he knew that many Tory MPs were absolutely furious with him for all that had gone on in Downing Street, the chaos and the lying to Parliament. And so he had a conversation with his advisers before he came to the House of Commons, and somebody suggested perhaps that he would raise this matter, this conspiracy theory, which has normally come from the very far right. And his advisors said, no, you mustn't do it. That's not a proper way to proceed. And yet he deliberately did so. And to me, that's the key point here. It is deliberate. It's not accidental. It's an attempt to incite a mob, either online or physically in person. And the thing is, we know how this plays out when politicians go down this deeply cynical route, because we saw it in the United States of America. It's exactly the same as Donald Trump's playbook. It's profoundly dangerous. It's not the way we do politics in this country. It's so un-British.
Bryant's information is interesting. Johnson made the remark despite the advice of his advisers, and indeed we saw his chief adviser, Munira Mirza, quit over the smear. In a report, the Huffington Post found a Tory MP who seemed to confirm that the comment was pretty calculated. So the Huffington Post report, this wasn't something said off the cuff, this is something we know people are talking about, one Tory MP said. They claimed it had been mentioned on the doorstep during the Batley and Spend by-election last summer, and that Johnson knew what he was doing when he made the comment. They even suggested Conservative campaign HQ would be stockpiling stories on Starmer's time as Director of Public Prosecutions. I'd expect to see some more of this sort of thing in the run-up to the next general election, they added. Still, some Tory frontbenchers just refused to see any link between Johnson's smear and the mob that harassed Starmer. Here's Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Tech and the Digital Economy, Chris Philp, talking to Kay Burley.
I don't think you can make a link reasonably between what the Prime Minister said and the harassment and intimidation. This group of people there were talking about a number of things beyond, as well as Jimmy Savile. They're people who have harassed other public figures, including journalists, over the last year or two. So I don't think you can make that link.
And when it came to the journalists and when it came to other people that they were harassing, did they mention Jimmy Savile then?
Well, they mentioned all kinds of things, as they did last
Jimmy
night.
Savile, then?
Well, no, because that wasn't an issue at the time. But
Exactly.
But the harassment...
Exactly.
But hang on, Kate, the harassment last night, they were talking about a whole number of things. They mostly talked about Julian Assange. If you listen to the entire clip, They were mostly going on about Julian Assange for some reason.
Kay Burley saying, exactly. Very well done, I thought. Whatever Philp thinks or doesn't think, recent polling suggests that the country isn't buying it. So a Snap poll from Savanta Comres shows 69% of people say the Prime Minister is responsible for Keir Starmer being harassed. 54% of 2019 Conservative voters also say this. 68% of all people say he should publicly apologise to all those polled. And 68% said he should withdraw the comments. And 64% say politics has gotten nastier in the last 5 years. So overwhelming majority of the public there suggesting that Boris Johnson is to blame for Keir Starmer being harassed by people in the street, and an overwhelming majority saying he should withdraw the comments and publicly apologise. Dahlia, do you think that sort of mob harassment of Keir Starmer and them repeating the words essentially that Boris Johnson used in Parliament, that he's someone who protects paedophiles, and then mentioning Jimmy Savile, do you think that has shown this stunt to have kind of backfired for the Prime Minister because he can't now distance himself from the sort of dark forces he was ultimately appealing to?
Well, this is a very classic strategy for right-wing politicians like Johnson. And we have to understand figures like him as part of quite a dangerous spectrum, because the strategy is, play up to certain kinds of respectability. So the liberal commentariat can kind of find excuses for you when they need to, whilst also giving just enough so that your far right base, you can call on them with legitimacy in times of need. And we saw this throughout the Trump presidency, although I think Trump made even fewer attempts to play up to any kind of respectability. But because of that, I don't think it will necessarily backfire, because the act itself was not targeted towards people who would be disgusted by it, which is actually a majority of people, but rather it's meant to try and, in his moment of weakness, consolidate a very particular part of his base, a hard right base invested in this kind of conspiratorial thinking, which is, it's yes, very small, but it's very committed, and it has a role to play within the Conservative Party, and particularly the Conservative membership. And when Boris Johnson was in the race for Tory leadership, I went on Sky News and I made this argument that Boris Johnson was kind of proto-fascist. And at that time, the point that I was trying to make was that fascism doesn't start with people marching down the streets in uniform. It starts with the normalization and empowerment of far-right talking points in the mainstream. It starts with people who have material and political power, like Boris Johnson, calling on and relying on far-right political forces for their legitimacy in times of political crisis. That's when it becomes really dangerous. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing him trying to consolidate himself during a moment of political weakness. And, he might not use these talking points every day. He doesn't always compare Muslim women to letterboxes or say derogatory things about people of the global South. But that implicit reliance and grooming of this logic and of this constituency, and relying on these weapons in his arsenal during those times of crisis, is why he's dangerous. And it's why Johnson always has been dangerous. And it's also, unfortunately, to look at it in a more short-term sense, just another example of Johnson acting with total impunity and irresponsibility and being motivated by nothing else but his own political survival, regardless of whatever kind of carnage or collateral damage that will cause. Much like the decision to prematurely end mandatory isolation before the scientific advice has properly come out in favor of that, regardless of what impact that might have, the deliberate deploying of this particular talking point is also, it's a way of trying to appeal to a key part and consolidate his base and recover power. But much like with the end to isolation rules, this isn't, what's at stake here is not just silly Westminster games. Like, what kind of irreparable damage could this cause? And for what? So that he can continue to be prime minister? And what this shows me is that the kind of very empty apologies and promises of change that we have heard over the past couple of weeks from Boris Johnson, this just goes to show that this leopard has not and will never change his ghastly and power-hungry spots. The question of backfiring is a difficult one, is because, as I said, the target isn't us. The target isn't people that would hear this and be disgusted by it. The target is the particular faction within the Conservative base, within particularly the membership, that are part of this particular political milieu.